company which started from the bottom, only to end up dominating an entire industry for multiple years. A company that became the definition of fun and relaxation for millions of people all around the world. A company that sold over 30 million copies of a console at a time when most people viewed consoles as either garbage or overpriced. A company that you never even hear about anymore. That's right. Today, we're going to talk about Sega. Back in the late 80s and early 90s, a time when people still thought dial-up internet and fax machines were the future, Sega burst onto the scene. Starting as underdogs in competition with giants like Nintendo, they were revolutionary in the gaming scene, introducing us to classics like Super Street Fighter 2, Contra Hard Corps, Mortal Kombat 2, and of course, the iconic franchise which would influence the future of entertainment by making Sega the unprecedented king of games with attitude. Crazy Taxi. Oh yeah, they also made this pretty cool game called Sonic the Hedgehog. I'm not sure if you've heard of it though. But how did everything start? Where did they come from? Well, it's quite the journey. Would you believe it all started way back in 1940 in the sunny paradise of Hawaii? Back then, they were known as standard games, cooking up coin-operated games like slot machines, which were mainly sold locally at military bases on the islands. Fast forwarding to the early 1950s, a new gambling law in the US made their core business model a bit of a problem. So what did they do? Well, naturally they packed their bags and sailed across the Pacific to Japan. They rebranded themselves as Service Games of Japan and started supplying coin-operated games to US military bases, not only in Japan but across all of Asia. A few business ventures in pinball machines and jukeboxes later, Service Games merged with a company called Rosen Enterprises to create a company which eventually landed on making coin-operated arcade games in the 1960s. The company was named after the first two letters of the words Service Games and was followed by Enterprises. Sega Enterprises was born. In 1965, Sega released their first commercially sold game, an electromechanical game called Periscope, which simulated submarine warfare. It experienced more success than Sega anticipated, and it was exported to both Europe and the United States, and was placed in malls and department stores, becoming the first arcade game in the US to cost 25 cents per play. A few arcade games later, and Sega, which had undergone several name changes and was now known as Sega Electronics, had made it to the early 80s, the golden age of gaming. If only that were true. You see, there was this small issue known as the video game crash of 1983, where the US video game market went from a valuation of $42 billion in 1982 to $14 billion in 1985. I hope you're seeing how Sega was probably in quite a lot of trouble around this time. Despite this crash, Sega survived, unlike almost every other video game manufacturer of the era, because of some very clever decisions on their part. Since Sega produced arcade machines, their future didn't look very successful, so they decided to take a risk and switch to producing home consoles instead. Sega released their first home console in Japan, the SG-1000, on the 15th of July 1983, which by the way was the same day Nintendo decided to release their family computer, aka the Famicom, in Japan. So that was great. The SG-1000 console series had sold over 1.4 million units in Japan by 1988. Overall, the SG-1000 had little impact on the gaming industry, but it marked Sega's origins in the console business. The SG-1000 may not have been a smash hit. However, Sega still had some ideas up their sleeve about the next generation console, but more about that later. What most people remember Sega for was the games. And let's be honest, they definitely had a golden child. Released in 1991, Sonic the Hedgehog catapulted Sega into the spotlight, marking the birth of a gaming icon. As an attempt to establish Sega's own Mario, it was an instant success, and even today Sega is usually remembered as the birthplace of Sonic. Sonic was different. He wasn't bland like Mario, he had an attitude. Stop playing for a couple minutes and let Sonic stand there? Nah. He'd start tapping his feet to remind you that you are wasting his time. Sonic wasn't about saving some princess and running off into the sunset. He was about running down enemies and showing off while doing it. It felt like he had a soul, which was something that had been missing in gaming for a while. He quickly became a beloved character by teenagers and adults, which propelled Sega's status as a leading video game company during the fourth generation of gaming consoles. The game's success was nothing short of extraordinary, as it combined innovative gameplay with memorable characters, and of course, it had a fast-paced and extremely catchy soundtrack, so that didn't hurt either. Sonic's popularity wasn't confined to the gaming world. It transcended into a multimedia franchise with sequels, spin-offs, merchandise, and even a live-action movie in recent years, but we can forget about that one. The legacy of Sonic the Hedgehog's early triumphs continues to influence the gaming industry and entertain fans worldwide to this day. 1991 was important for another reason though. It was also the year that Nintendo, Sega's biggest rival, released the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, or SNES for short, in North America. This spelled a huge problem for Sega, since the SNES was a console which gave us Super Mario World, The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past, Super Mario Kart, and of course Donkey Kong Country. These games were bought up like crazy. Sega was incredibly successful, but Nintendo was on steroids. Millions and millions of copies of Nintendo game sales swamped Sega's. However, remember that Sega didn't just make games. Sega made some killer consoles back in their day, with classics like the Sega Saturn, Sega Dreamcast, and of course, their crown jewel, the Genesis. Known as the Mega Drive in Japan and other parts of the world, excluding North America, the Sega Genesis was released in 1988 and sold an astounding 30 million units worldwide, with 18 million of those being North American sales, before it was discontinued in 1997. The console was viewed as groundbreaking by those who purchased it, and was the boost Sega needed to become a dominant video game publisher. You have to remember, Sega only had 1/30th of the budget that Nintendo had. They just couldn't compete with them by making a slightly different 8-bit NES clone. Sega couldn't copy, they had to innovate. And trust me, they did not take the easy route. No, what they chose to do was accelerate the development of home consoles by years, if not a whole decade. They made gaming 16-bit. Customers were blown away by the cutting-edge 16-bit graphics of the Genesis. It wasn't all performance though. Sega chose to focus their marketing for the console on aggressively seeking and destroying any superiority Nintendo had over them. This campaign can be summed up by one iconic slogan: Genesis does what Nintendo don't.
Buy a 16-bit Genesis system between now and October.
David had just declared war on Goliath. The console wars had begun. In 1990, Nintendo controlled 90% of the video game market, but just like Rocky Balboa beating Apollo Creed, just 1 year later, Sega had gained a majority in the video game console market. Nintendo was stunned, but they weren't going to take this lie down. What followed was years of back and forth innovation aimed at destroying the other's reputation. Nintendo publicly acknowledged that it was no longer in the dominant position in the console market by 1992. Nintendo took drastic actions. A year into the Super Nintendo's release, the Super Nintendo's price was lowered to $149, the exact same price as the Genesis. Sega's response? The price of the Genesis was reduced to $129 right after. The Super Nintendo outsold the Genesis in the US in 1992, but even still, by the beginning of the following year, Sega still held 55% of the market share. In 1993, the genre of fighting games was on the rise. Mortal Kombat, released 3 years previously, was exploding in popularity. The game was mostly known for its heavy use of violence and gore, which included ripping out your opponent's heart or even pulling their head off with the spine still attached. Both Nintendo and Sega knew they needed to have Mortal Kombat 2 on their consoles, but Nintendo wanted to remain with their PG image. Nintendo decided to release a clean version of the game, while Sega did not, choosing to publish the gore-filled original instead. Both games were a huge success, but Sega outsold Nintendo 3-1. It soon became apparent that the public was very concerned with the amount of violence in the Genesis version, which led to congressional hearings on the matter in December 1993. The hearings resulted in the creation of the Entertainment Software Rating Board, or ESRB for short. Yeah, you know those ratings that are on the front of every game case? The ones that say teen, mature, adults only, they only exist because Sega was seen as too edgy by the activists. I'm sure you now understand why people who owned Sega consoles thought they were so cool. After this scandal, the cracks in Sega's plans started to show. The downfall of Sega had begun, and it wasn't due to some freak accident or a master plan from within the company to take it down. No, it was sparked by something that Nintendo didn't have, but Sega had a lot of. Debt. Sega had aggressively taken the US market from Nintendo, but that was an expensive feat, and Nintendo had business all over the world. Nintendo was still a juggernaut after everything. The battles continued for a while until the largest domino toppled in December 1994. A new competitor joined the scene. Sony had announced their PlayStation, but Sega took this on the chin, confident that their next console to be launched in North America, the Sega Saturn would easily dominate over the PlayStation. And it wasn't just Sega who thought this. The press was confident that the Saturn was the better of the two. In 1995, Sega, Nintendo, and Sony attended the very first E3 event to showcase their new consoles. Sega demonstrated the features of the Saturn to a very impressed audience, and announced that the price of the Saturn was going to be $399, and that Sega had already shipped units to lots of retailers in preparation for the high demand for the Saturn on launch day. Then, Sony demonstrated their PlayStation on stage at E3. The presentation ended with Steve Race, president of Sony America, saying this.
$299.
What followed was a commercial massacre. Several stores pulled Sega from their lineup as a response for being excluded from early Saturn sales, and the suddenly expensive Saturn failed to come anywhere near the estimated launch sales. When the PlayStation launched in the US, its sales over the first 2 days were greater than what the Saturn had sold over the previous 5 months. Sega's heavy investment in the Saturn had returned them nothing. Before Sega could even come up with a solution, Nintendo had just shocked the world by scrapping the 32-bit console and releasing the first 3D gaming console, the N64. The following year. By this point, the console wars between Nintendo and Sega had evaporated, with both companies now facing Sony as their rival. By the late 90s, Sega was getting exhausted. The world was moving on from their outdated hardware, with the discontinuation of their last-ditch attempt at a competitive home video game console, the Dreamcast. On the 31st of March 2001, Sega threw in the towel. The era of consoles with attitude was over, killed by poor decision-making and inability to financially support their aggressive marketing. But don't worry, Sega wasn't done. They didn't just fade into gaming history and give up. They embraced their inner talents and came back with the sole purpose of making video games. Sega became a third-party developer. Sonic and others kept appearing all over gaming, except this time it was on other companies' consoles. The 2000s was a busy time for Sega. They developed classics like Super Monkey Ball, Jet Set Radio, and many more Sonic games. They even partnered with their old rival Nintendo to publish Mario and Sonic at the Olympic Games, a series, by the way, which is still updated every summer and winter games. And that leaves us with the question, is Sega dead? No. Maybe Sega didn't win the console wars, and maybe they're not a staple name in the gaming industry like they used to be, but they definitely won a place in the history of gaming. Without Sega, it's possible that today 3D gaming would only be a recent occurrence, since without Sega never giving Nintendo a spare second to relax, they indirectly forced video game technology to develop at a rate which had never been seen before, and hasn't since. Sega, along with others, shaped the foundations of what makes a good video game. They're no longer the king of gaming that they used to be, and they don't release cutting-edge consoles like they used to. In fact, they don't release any. They become a third-party developer, bringing us gems like Yakuza and Total War in recent years. After decades of creativity, it's nice to see that Sega is still producing quality games, because at the end of the day, they gave some of us some of our most cherished memories. In the world of gaming, Sega will always be an icon. And that startup screen will forever be etched into the memories of millions.
And there you have it, the incredible journey of Sega. If you enjoyed this ride, please don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and ring that notification bell, because you never know when the next adventure is coming your way. Take care now.